Hi, this is Peter Beinart. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Larry Summers, someone who really doesn't need much introduction, but for those, but he for just to get do the formalities, he's the Charles Eliot University professor at Harvard. He's the former president of Harvard University. He's the former United States Secretary of the Treasury. He's someone I've known for a long time, and I've always found to be really, despite his many accolades, always very, very generous and kind in his personal interactions. Obviously, mostly a lot of what he focuses on is economics, given he's one of the world's most famous economists. But we're really going to talk about another subject that he's been quite public about recently, which is about Israel, Zionism, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and of course, Harvard. So, Larry, thank you for doing this.
Very glad to be with you, Peter.
So I wanted to start with a personal question. I'm curious about some of the life experiences that have led you to feel strongly about the question of Israel and anti-Semitism, since it's clearly been something particularly recently, and going back to your presidency, that you've wanted to speak out about.
Peter, I'm not entirely sure that I have access to all the reasons why I have feelings and views that I have. My life has certainly not been defined by spiritualism or by extensive participation in Jewish community activities. I I was not bar mitzvahed. My children were. Bas mitzvah or bar mitzvah. I did find when I got to Harvard that I became aware of a sense of Jewish identity, issues around Israel and anti-Semitism in a way that I had not before.
You talking
I
about what time period? You're not talking about as a
got to
faculty member, as a
Harvard as
student?
president. I got to
Oh,
Harvard
as
as
president.
president
Okay.
in 2001 when I was in the Clinton administration. I served alongside Bob Rubin, Alan Greenspan, Jack Lew, Peter Orszag, Charlene Barshevsky, Janet Yellen, and
A lot of
never
Jews.
really much thought about
Hmm.
the ethnic composition of that group. Somehow, this set of issues came to have more salience for me in the time after I arrived at Harvard. So, probably the first very striking experience I had in this regard was on the late afternoon of September 11th, when in my first year as president, that event had taken place and it had been decided that there was going to be a vigil or a convening in Harvard Yard in the late afternoon. And it was clear that since I was the person who had the title president, that I would be expected to speak. And it was not the kind of moment or the kind of setting or the kind of subject to which economists and even public economic officials were accustomed to speaking. So I was quite uncertain as to what I should say. And I was given a lot of advice by the people in the Harvard system whose job it was to help a Harvard president at moments like this. And I was struck that the advice I received was to speak in ways that were completely equivalent, it seemed to me, to the ways one would have spoken if there had been an earthquake or a tsunami in New York that had killed 3,000 people. And it seemed to me that while there had been a tragedy, and it was certainly appropriate to be speaking to that tragedy, there were moral aspects around evil having been done and that no one could responsibly speak to the moment without recognizing that. And so I certainly didn't condemn the country of Saudi Arabia or refer to Islamic terrorism, but I found my way to using the word terror and the word evil, and I thought that was right. And I was struck uh, by the fact that that was seen by some as an unusual choice to have made. Then, perhaps a year later, there was a substantial movement among the MIT and Harvard faculties, perhaps 10% of the faculty, to demand that the university divest, at that time, any company that was doing business with Israel because of Israel's alleged um, perfidy with respect to the peace process. And there were associated efforts to fund and raise money, including from the university's funds, for organizations that the State Department had listed as in support of terror. And it seemed to me that it was appropriate to be critical of those pressures in ways that went beyond saying, and the familiar debates about whether divestiture was or was not a good tool for universities to use, whether or not divestiture was politicizing universities. It seemed to me that it was quite problematic to be demonizing Israel to that extent when people were also being supportive of terrorist uh, activities, um, seemed to me imprudent and unwise.
Mhm.
And I felt that I certainly had no authority and certainly should not exercise any authority to stop anybody from petitioning. I certainly should not in any way attempt to censor people. But my understanding of academic freedom was very clear that academic freedom did not include freedom from criticism. And so it seemed to me that the thinking was not sound.
Mhm.
And it seemed to me, and this was the phrase that was remembered from what I said, that people who I labeled as serious and thoughtful
Mhm.
were advocating positions that, if implemented,
Mhm.
would be anti-Semitic in their effect, if not their intent.
Mhm.
And so I wasn't calling anybody an anti-Semite, but I was saying that if the world's most prominent university
Mhm.
literally did what it was being demanded that it do
Mhm. Mhm.
and refused to hold stock in any company that was willing to do business with Israel, that that would be widely seen as anti-Semitic,
Mhm.
given that Israel was the Jewish state.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think I was right then, and I would say the same thing uh, today. And it seemed to me that I was applying the kind of standard that has been applied at Harvard and other universities for many, many years. it happened a few years after, some years after my remarks, but there was an incident sometime in the decade of the teens where a very small group, not 10% of the faculty, 7 students at the extension school,
Hmm.
announced that they were going to hold a black mass
Hmm. Hmm.
because they thought it was a good idea to hold a black mass.
Right.
And the then president of Harvard spoke out, I thought, strongly and appropriately,
Hmm.
saying that they had the right, they had their academic freedom, free speech right
Hmm.
to do as they wished,
Hmm.
and that she, as president, had the right to share how appalled she was by the choice that they had made
Right.
and how destructive and damaging she thought it was likely to be.
Hmm.
And there are many instances in the history of
Yeah.
universities and of Harvard where academic leaders have not censored, but have criticized and attempted to shape the dialogue with their criticism about what they regarded as illogical and irrational prejudice
Right.
by members of the community. And
Right.
that
Yep. Yeah.
seems to, that was the approach that I took.
Yeah.
It seems to me to be the approach that academic leaders should take.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it is the job of academic leaders to do that. And it is also the job of academic leaders to protect the reputation of the university. I am instructed as a
Right.
faculty member
Right.
each year that as I think about my various activities with
Right.
business, that I need to understand that I'm not supposed to embarrass
Yes.
the
Yes. Yes.
university. And
Yes.
it seems to me that when deans give speeches or center directors write letters,
Right.
that a similar kind of standard is appropriate. And so I
Right.
have
Yeah.
felt that it's appropriate for me to speak out on these issues. When the Harvard Crimson editorialized in
Yes.
favor of BDS, I
Yeah.
was sharply critical and
Yes.
also sharply critical of the failure of leaders to
Right.
respond more vigorously to that.
Right, right, right. So let me ask about and push back a little bit on this question of on the idea that boycotting Israel or divesting from Israel is anti-Semitic. Um, Israel, the BDS movement was kind of modeled on the movement of calling for boycotts of apartheid South Africa. It was launched after this international court had ruled that Israel's separation barrier that was mostly built inside the West Bank on Palestinian land was illegal. Israel has now been classified as practicing apartheid even by Israel's own leading human rights organizations. Boycotts and divestment is a nonviolent tactic. And it's true that Israel isn't necessarily the only or even worst human rights abuser in the world, but the BDS movement came from Palestinian civil society, and Palestinians said, "We ask the world to boycott." As a nonviolent effort to try to bring us our rights. And that seems to me to put Israel in a different category than countries that are doing terrible things, where the civil society of the oppressed people have not come together and asked for a boycott. It's like a picket line in front of a business, and they say, "Please don't cross the picket line," right? That distinguishes the business from another business that's doing bad things, but where there isn't a picket line. So if Palestinians are asking that Israel be boycotted, and it's a nonviolent tactic, why is it anti-Semitic in intent? I sorry, in effect. Sorry, not in intent, but in effect. Sorry, in effect.
Because I think it's anti-Semitic in effect, because Israel is heavily defined as the Jewish state.
Hmm.
And I have no doubt, and I don't think you should have any doubt,
Hmm.
that if there was a highly problematic practice that was being pursued in 11 countries around the world,
Hmm.
and that someone advocated that only Nigeria
Hmm. mhm,
He boycotted
mhm,
because of that.
mhm, mhm,
The decision to boycott Nigeria,
mhm,
but not Italy,
mhm,
but not Thailand, would be deemed to have a racist element. And that would be surely a widely held view in university communities and probably would not be an unreasonable view.
mhm,
And I agree
mhm,
that in making judgments about this, the degree of evil is relevant, the degree of connection and resonance
mhm,
with concerns
mhm,
in our own country is relevant. The extent to which the victims
mhm,
um, are being are asking and encouraging allies to do this. All of those things enter into a sensible calculus.
mhm,
But I have no doubt that if an African country were being singled out
mhm,
heavily, it would be thought of as racist. If an Asian country were being singled out, it would be widely seen as as anti-Asian, and that's why I felt that saying that it would be anti-Semitic in its effect would be there. Now, there's a question as to how best to judge
mhm,
what whether I'm right or
mhm,
not. I think it's certainly the case in 2002. I would admit that there's more ambiguity today.
mhm,
Certainly was the case in 2002 that the Jewish community around the world
mhm, mhm,
um, would have seen
mhm,
a decision of that kind
mhm,
by Harvard as anti-Semitic. Now, that shouldn't necessarily be entirely defining
mhm,
of what is anti-Semitic,
mhm,
but it is part of reaching a judgment
mhm.
about what is anti-Semitic.
Right. But I guess, I mean, on the question of being singled out, I mean, the US imposes sanctions on many, many countries, right? I mean, many, many countries that we consider human rights abusers already have sanctions from the US government, right? It means to be part of the reason for the BDS movement is precisely because unlike a lot of other countries that have been found to commit human rights abuses, China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, where the US government has imposed sanctions, this is a situation where the US government actually is giving Israel all of these weapons. And so, under those conditions, calling for a boycott of that country doesn't seem to me singling out in the way you're suggesting, as if all these other countries are getting off scot-free.
So, I think there are several points to be made. First of all, we're not talking about appeals to the US government.
Hmm.
And if we were talking about appeals to the US government, there might be a different set of standards, and
Hmm.
I, as president of Harvard, wouldn't be addressing
Hmm.
um, the US government. And Harvard certainly was involved in extensive cooperation with China
Hmm.
in the relevant intervals. Harvard was involved with substantial involvement with Iran
Hmm.
during this period. Harvard was involved in substantial cooperation with Saudi Arabia
Hmm.
uh, during this period. So, some argument that this was simply a call to have
Hmm.
the same standard applied to Israel that Harvard was applying to other countries,
Hmm.
I actually think is not
Hmm.
a uh, tenable
Hmm.
uh, argument.
Hmm.
The closest thing there is to an analogy is the one that you referenced earlier, Peter, to South Africa. But I think there's a difference between difference uh, between occupied territories in the aftermath of a war
mhm,
and the situation that took place in South Africa. And
mhm,
I am very much aware of the flaws of Israeli society with
mhm,
respect to its Arab and Palestinian populations
mhm,
uh, in uh, is in Israel, but at the same time, I don't think that the oppression standard is quite the right standard to apply. And I also think there is uh, context and judgment that has to be applied here as to whether the extent to which there is a self-defense rationale,
mhm,
not necessarily that the level of social self-defense is
mhm,
appropriate,
mhm,
but the existence of the Intifada
mhm,
is surely relevant in thinking about the moral calculus in 2002.
mhm,
The nature of the Hamas attack
mhm,
is certainly relevant
mhm,
in thinking about the appropriate response in October of 2023.
mhm.
So I I'm comfortable with the positions that I have taken. And
Mhm.
to be clear, that is certainly not to say that if the choices were mine, I would make the choices that Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli government
Mhm.
have made. Uh, that is not to say that I don't think strong criticism of some of the choices
Mhm.
they have made are appropriate.
Mhm.
But I do think that the way in which I have spoken about what the consequences of certain actions would be uh, is appropriate. And I
It,
must say, Peter, I'll just say
yeah.
just one more observation. Something that surprised me.
Mhm.
Um, I'm sure this won't carry a lot of weight with you, but it did influence me. Um, in the wake of my remarks,
Mhm.
I was kind of overwhelmed by the number of people inside the community
Mhm.
who reached out to congratulate me for my courage.
Right.
I thought I had been thoughtful,
Right.
had contributed usefully to a debate, but I didn't think I'd been particularly courageous
Yeah.
because I didn't think I was putting anything of me at great risk.
Mhm.
Um, but the fact that so many people felt that I had been courageous said to me that there was much more in the environment
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
that people found inhibiting of expressing
Mhm.
the kind of opinion that I had expressed than I had realized.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is part of what has kept me going
Mhm.
on this stream.
Yeah. 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 No, I don't doubt that there are many, many Jews who feel that way. I wanted to go back to the question of apartheid because I do think it bears on this question of whether what Israel is doing is so egregious that one should think, that one should think about things like boycotts and divestment, and also use a term like apartheid. And to kind of make the counter argument a little bit, um, uh, um, in 1967, Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza, right? That was 20 years before the creation of Hamas. It was 20 years before the outbreak of the first Intifada. Israel took over that territory. which gave it control of millions of Palestinians who it didn't give citizenship to. It placed under military law. It didn't give them the right to vote for the government that now controlled their lives. And then in the 70s, Israel starts to build settlements and it establishes two sets of laws. One for Israeli citizens who are settlers in the West Bank, and the other for Palestinians. Two completely different legal systems: one civil law with due process, one military law. And so I don't think it's surprising under those conditions that most of the most famous Black South African leaders, like Desmond Tutu, who won the Nobel Prize, like Cyril Ramaphosa, the current government, categorize this as apartheid because under international law, apartheid is, I think it's defined as systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another, and racial in this context can mean ethnic or religious. And so, why don't you think that apartheid is an accurate term to describe such a system? Again, B'Tselem and Yesh Din, Israel's human rights organizations, have said they think this constitutes apartheid, certainly in the West Bank.
So first, first of all, Peter, if if the only thing that happened on the Harvard campus was that a bunch of people went around offering their opinion that this constituted apartheid, I don't think I ever would have been led to comment on the subject. What led me to comment on the subject was that they had developed a series of intellectual arguments, a
Mhm,
chain, if you like,
mhm,
pointing to the conclusion
mhm,
that the university should take a highly public,
mhm,
dramatic,
mhm,
substantially unconventional action of ostracism of Israel. And when I have spoken out, it has not been with respect to the expression of an opinion that it's apartheid. It's been with respect to the proposal of taking a extraordinarily strong kind of action.
right, but
Point one.
they're related because
Well,
you
they're
didn't
related,
oppose
but they're related, but it's
because you
quite
didn't
different.
oppose Harvard doing this vis-a-vis South Africa.
I
For,
didn't advocate. I actually never participated in that
right.
debate,
Do
and
you think it was a
I
mistake?
was I don't I wouldn't want to say that it was a mistake, but I wouldn't want to say that it was a clearly, obviously correct and appropriate thing to do. And there were some substantial number of thoughtful advocates who felt that it was ultimately setting back the cause of Black South Africans. So I can argue both sides of that, and I think a very large part of what was going on in South Africa was in the South African case was the resonance between the horror of Jim Crow in the United States
Mhm.
and apartheid in South Africa that made that issue seem more different. I am not going to defend, and certainly I'm not going to debate with you because you've spent much more of your life studying it than I, the nuances or the details of Israeli policy. I was struck that your way of describing things left out some things that seem important to me.
Mhm.
It was major wars of surprise aggression in 1967 and 1973
Mhm.
that prompted the occupation of the West Bank and other territories. It was, I think it is fair to say, a continuing doctrine of those, if not all, many who governed
Mhm.
those territories,
Mhm.
that Israel as a Jewish state
Mhm.
should cease to exist
Mhm.
and shouldn't be permitted to continue to exist, and to back those statements with state-sponsored violence on on a substantial scale. And so I think that is certainly an element in the moral calculus. And I also think that it is appropriate, and this is a question that reasonable people can disagree on, but my view always was and is that Harvard is a kind of institutional citizen of the United States,
Hmm.
not a world political actor
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
its own seat at the UN, so to speak.
Hmm.
And so it seemed to me appropriate that if Harvard is going to take major political actions, it should give substantial deference
Hmm.
to the judgments that the U.S. government is making, particularly when those are bipartisan uh, judgments, and particularly when those are longstanding judgments. And whatever you may believe about the quality of the apartheid
Hmm.
analogy and the appropriateness of the apartheid analogy, I think it's fair to say that was not the position
Hmm.
of America. And that certainly would represent a distinction uh, with other with many other human rights cases.
I just wanted to, I'm curious about this point that you think that, if I'm getting you right, that Harvard, a group institution like Harvard or a president of Harvard and thinking about what moral positions they should take should be cognizant of what the bipartisan position is in Washington and kind of, but what about in the 1950s, there was bipartisan support for Jim Crow. Would it have been wrong for a president of Harvard to say that legalized segregation in the South is wrong?
I think by and large, the role of the university is not to take political positions
Hmm.
apart from those that bear very directly on the functioning of the university.
Hmm.
So I certainly would have thought it was outrageous for Harvard to have a position one way or the other
Hmm.
on the Iraq War.
Hmm.
I would have thought it was outrageous
Hmm.
for Harvard to have, for a Harvard center
Hmm.
to, speaking on behalf of Harvard University,
Hmm.
take a position on the Microsoft antitrust case.
Hmm.
Now, I think in the case of Jim Crow, Harvard is a place that stands for opportunity and inclusion.
Hmm.
And so you can make a set of arguments, but I think are reasonable arguments that it would be appropriate. I think it'd be more appropriate if the statement was more focused on issues around access to higher education.
Hmm.
But I also think there are questions about what is the appropriate level of action
Hmm.
as distinct from rhetoric. So to take a, I think the gays in the military policy was an appalling, misguided policy.
Hmm.
When we had the don't ask, don't tell policy, I strongly opposed it. But I equally strongly opposed the idea that the military shouldn't be able to use Harvard placement offices
Hmm.
because Harvard thought it was a discriminatory policy.
Hmm.
Because it seemed to me that as an institutional citizen of the United States,
Hmm.
Harvard had an obligation
Hmm.
to be prepared to participate
Hmm.
in the defense of the United States along the national security grounds
Hmm.
that had been determined through its democratic processes. And so I think that there is a distinction that's probably quite important to be drawn between foreign policy and national security
Hmm.
and internal domestic issues where it's appropriate for institutions as they conduct themselves to maintain an awareness of this idea of institutional citizenship.
Mhm. I I was one of the things I saw in a tweet you criticized Derek Pensler for having described Israel as settler colonialist. Um, and one of the things that I thought about when I saw this is that I think there's a pretty broad consensus among people who study Israel-Palestine, historians, that settler colonialism is a reasonable way of one framework for understanding the history of the Zionist movement. I mean, partly because early Zionists like Herzl and Jabotinsky used the term colonial themselves frequently to describe what they were doing. And I wondered when I heard you, and Pensler is also a scholar of this, and I don't mean this to come off as in any way disrespectful. I just wondered, do you feel like you have the scholarly background to question whether settler colonialism is a valid form of analysis? I mean, if someone were to intervene on a question of economic questions and I would about trade or tariffs or whatever, I think you would say, listen, buddy, like you don't know the scholarship here. Like, do you feel like you know the scholarship on Israel and Zionism well enough?
Peter, I think, look, it may be that you'll read the whole tweet and I will not be completely comfortable
Mhm,
with my precise phrasing,
mhm.
um, because I don't have the tweet in
Right,
front of me, don't remember precisely what I said.
right.
It would never have occurred to me to enter into a discussion
Mhm,
of Derek Pensler's views
mhm,
about any aspect
mhm,
of Israeli history
mhm,
if the university had not decided to set up parallel anti-Islamophobia task forces and anti-Semitism task forces, and to appoint as the head of the anti-Semitism task force a person who had expressed that set of views. And so I don't wouldn't presume to know whether Derek Pensler was expressing reasonable views or unreasonable views. It did seem to me that at a moment when we were going to have an Islamophobia task force and a anti-Semitism task force, that and at a moment when a university president had resigned
mhm,
because in part because she had been seen as insufficiently sensitive to anti-Semitism concerns, at a moment when the university was being besieged with phone calls from anxious parents about whether their Jewish children would be safe at Harvard. It did frankly seem to me to be reasonable to think that the person who would be chosen not to participate on, but to lead an anti-Semitism task force not be someone who had adopted your views
mhm,
on the questions associated with Israel.
mhm,
Not that those views are illegitimate, not that those views are wrong, but in the same way that there would be plenty of subjects where I would regard myself as having reasonable views, but the wrong person to appoint as the head of a task force in a complicated political environment. That was my view about the Pensler appointment. It was shared by the person who was originally appointed as a co-chair,
mhm,
who therefore resigned
mhm,
from the task force. And I think it was the right uh, judgment to have reached. If there had been one task force
mhm,
on religious prejudice on the Harvard campus, and there were several heads, and Professor Pensler was one of them,
mhm,
I would have had no objection.
mhm,
If there had been a task force and he had been recognized as a leading scholar
mhm,
in this area,
mhm,
I would have had no objection to his participating, but his being appointed as the sort of senior leader of such a task force at a moment of intense concern when he had adopted the apartheid rhetoric, which at a minimum is substantially controversial, the
Mhm.
settler colonialist rhetoric, which at a minimum is substantially controversial. It seemed to me that, if the anti Islamic task force had been headed by someone who had Bernard Lewis's views about Islamic societies,
Mhm.
that would have also influenced my view. But in the political environment that we were in, with two task forces
Mhm.
appointing someone who had Derek's record of statements seemed to be, at the time, to have been quite inappropriate and to have been undermining of the credibility of the effort
Mhm.
at a moment when it was very important for Harvard to project strong credibility. So I think I thought at the time very strongly it was a mistake. In fairness, I would say, while I have my disagreements, I think the report that was written was a very good one.
Mhm.
But that doesn't speak to whether it was reasonable to think at that time, after you had had one of America's most prominent rabbis resign from a previous task force. Um, I do think it
Yeah.
was an unwise
Right.
decision. And frankly, from my conversations at the time, I think it's fair to say that if there had been full thoughtfulness and full review of everything Professor Pensler had written before that appointment was made, I doubt that that appointment would have been made.
Mhm. So I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to ask you one more question. So, which has to do with the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which you support, and the way it's been used by the Trump administration. In 2019, during the first Trump administration, Kenneth Stern, who was one of the drafters of the IHRA definition, said that it was being misused by the Trump administration and it was dangerous because of the way it could be used to suppress academic freedom. And it seems to me there was evidence already from the first Trump administration that the IHRA definition, particularly in the hands of the Trump administration, could be a very, very dangerous weapon, given that it says that one of the examples of anti-Semitism is calling Israel a racist endeavor. I'm curious about your decision to still support this definition, given the way, in fact, in which I think it's being used by the current administration to justify its attack on universities and even the detention of students for doing nothing more than writing op-eds, for instance, in the case of Mahmoud Khalil.
God knows I hold no brief for the Trump administration.
Mhm.
I hold no brief for what the Trump administration has done in attacking universities, and I hold no brief for the various doctrines that the Trump administration has put forth involving the IHRA
Mhm.
definition. I have a quite different perspective on all this, and you know, I don't think it's that popular, but uh, among people at any point in this debate, but it's my view, Peter. And that's something like this. Um, the First Amendment applies to public institutions.
Mhm.
It doesn't apply to private institutions. But Harvard and other universities, as they have adopted academic freedom, have invoked First Amendment free speech concepts
Mhm.
as how they think about academic freedom. So they have chosen to be governed by First Amendment, to govern themselves by analogy to First Amendment law. First Amendment law is entirely clear
Mhm.
that racist speech
Mhm.
is protected speech,
Mhm.
and that unless racist speech I'm not using the exactly correct words, but you'll know what I mean, creates imminent physical danger. It is protected speech and it cannot be censored, punished, or shut down.
mhm,
So I don't believe that labeling speech as anti-Semitic
mhm,
constitutes a basis for censoring it
mhm,
or
mhm,
punishing it.
mhm,
I have thought that universities, including Harvard, have made a serious mistake when they utter sentences like anti-Semitism will not be tolerated on our campus.
mhm,
Because if you believe in free speech, then you believe in tolerating in the sense of allowing to exist, though not necessarily allowing to go uncriticized,
mhm,
anti-Semitic speech.
mhm,
So my view is that the IHRA definition is helpful and you and I probably disagree on this, in helpful in thinking about what is and is not usefully thought of as highly problematic speech and whether speech qualifies for the kind of response that President Faust gave to the Black Mass
mhm,
is, I think, usefully informed
mhm,
by the IHRA definition.
mhm,
But no, I don't think that it's useful as a definition of what should be censored or what should be punished.
mhm.
I do think there are questions. I'd be interested in whether you agree or disagree with me on this, on what constitutes appropriate speech and appropriate constraints on speech
Mhm,
for university leaders speaking on official occasions.
mhm, mhm,
So, for example, when the dean of Harvard's Divinity School
mhm,
um, spoke very substantially in parallel
mhm,
of the Holocaust and the events of 1948 that she labeled as the Nakba,
mhm,
and recognized that there were differences in between them,
mhm,
but chose to speak of them as parallel tragedies.
mhm.
That seemed to me to be an entirely inappropriate thing for a university dean to do at a central official function of her school,
Because she mentioned
almost
any.
independent of the precise merits of, I mean, I thought for me, the comparison of the Holocaust and the Nakba is grotesque, um, and morally insensate. But I understand that people disagree
Mhm,
on on that proposition, and perhaps you do.
mhm.
But it seems to me that it's not your job as the dean at a convocation to join external divisive issues
But
in
wait,
the way that was done at that moment.
so the issue was that she was discussing things that were divisive. So if she had just talked about the evils of the slave trade and the Holocaust, that would have been okay. But because the Nakba was divisive, that was the problem.
No. It was a current external political controversy where the university shouldn't be taking a view, and speeches by university leaders on official occasions can be reasonably interpreted as university views. This is the set of issues that goes under the label, the Calvin principles, goes under the label of institutional neutrality. And this seemed to me to be a gross violation of institutional neutrality. And yes, I will plead guilty to being more alarmed about violations of institutional neutrality where the sentiments being expressed are deeply offensive to me than I am about violations of institutional neutrality where the sentiments are congenial. But in general, I think institutional neutrality is a principle that should be very much respected. So the answer is, I think the IHRA definition is a useful guideline for thinking about what kinds of statements are and are not problematic as anti-Semitic, just as some definition of racism would be helpful in thinking about some judgments about what speech is racist and is not. But the invocation of the IHRA definition as a basis for punishment um, of anybody or censorship of anybody except for deans, except for people speaking on behalf of the university in their role as spokesman on behalf of the university, that should be subject to more constraint. But community members expressing opinions certainly should not be censored or punished based on any definition of anti-Semitism.
Right, but you do think that one of the examples of anti-Semitism, for instance, in the IHRA definition, is calling Israel a racist endeavor. Well, why is it anti-Semitic to call Israel a racist endeavor? People call America a racist endeavor all the time.
I'm not going to defend the every nuance of the IHRA definition, and I'm not. I don't know all the various caveats associated with that statement, Peter. And I also, I think, would say that uh, when you have failed in the many ways that I think Harvard did fail to condemn really quite appalling acts, if you've then done something where the pendulum has swung a little too far in the other direction, it'd be better if you didn't do that. But I'm not going to go to the barricades that that's the end of the world.
I told your colleague that we would be done by 11. It's almost 10 past 11, so I should let you go. Larry, thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Peter.